Good afternoon. It's a little bit of a lunch hangover, isn't it? So I'm an applied futurist. I'll forgive you if I'm the first one you've met. I'm the only one I know. But what it means is that I work with big companies, actually quite a lot of Collective's customers, people like HSBC and Accenture and BASF, to answer three questions. What does our future look like? Particularly focused on the near future, the really tricky bit, the 2 to 5 year term. How do we tell that story, and helping them to tell that story to their customers and their colleagues and their shareholders? I've actually appeared in quite a few of those videos, so somewhere in those few million hours of video, I'm probably popping up here and there. And what do we do about it? How on earth do we change our organisations, change our behaviour to respond to this pace of change we see? And that pace of change is actually why I get called on quite often. Companies tend to call me, people tend to call me when they feel like their heads are spinning, when they feel like they can't quite keep up. Sometimes that's because they've had a nasty shock. They didn't see something coming and it's happened and it's tripped them up and they're worried about it happening again. And sometimes it's out of a sense of opportunity. We feel like things are changing really fast and we can take advantage of this. How do we do that? And I try and help them do these things. But the first thing I have to do is try and explain to them why they feel like that. Why do they feel like their heads are spinning, like change is happening faster, like they can't keep up? And my explanation starts in perhaps an unusual place. Have you ever heard the question, would you rather fight 1 horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? It's an absurd question, an absolutely absurd question that, as far as I can tell, was dreamt up by some stoners in Manchester after one too many joints. But it became an internet meme. It spread and it spread and it spread and became an absolute favourite of Reddit. And in 2012, someone actually asked Barack Obama, would you rather fight 1 horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? He didn't have a good answer to this. But I'd like you to have a good answer to this, because it's probably going to come up at some point. And the answer to this is, it depends on what you're prepared to fight. If you're going to have to tackle one giant, flapping, quacking nightmare, you're going to want a completely different set of tools and tactics to if you're going to be combating a sort of whinnying horde down here. Either's possible, as long as you're prepared for it. And I think most of our organisations have spent the last 50, 100 years, the whole of our business theory and business practice is prepared for tackling change that looks like 1 horse-sized duck. Big, slow-moving, disruptive change. Whereas today we're increasingly tackling 100 duck-sized horses. Let me explain what that means. There's an argument going on between two different tribes. There is an argument going on between accelerationists and historians. Accelerationists are what you might call the Silicon Valley crew. They're probably led by Ray Kurzweil, the chief futurist of Google. And they have this idea that we're moving towards some sort of singularity, that the pace of change is accelerating exponentially. And it comes back to Moore's law. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Moore's law. Rewind 60 years, the co-founder of Intel notices that the number of transistors you can economically fit on a silicon chip is doubling every 2 years. Or to you and I, the bang for buck we get out of a phone improves every 2 years, doubles every 2 years. And they map this back through the course of technological history, and they say, look at the pace of change accelerating, it's getting faster and faster and faster. And at some point we're going to hit this singularity, and the change is going to go off the charts. And they say, look at the current period. Look at all these new products and services coming around. That's never happened before. And the historians pipe up and go, hang on a minute. Look at the last century. Look at some colossal shifts that happened. Huge, disruptive, cross-cultural, global shifts, often driven by technology. Are you really saying that the internet age is more disruptive than the Industrial Revolution? And I think they're both wrong and I think they're both right. Because I don't think you can measure change in such a simplistic metric, a single metric as speed. History books don't have a speedometer on them. This was a fast period, this was a slow period. Who would choose to study the slow periods? You can't measure something as complex as change in that single metric. I think you have to think about it a little more carefully, and that engineering degree that Craig talked about comes in pretty useful here. Let me give me some examples that the historians would point to. Because if you rewind over the last century, you can look at some really interesting shifts. Shifts like the switch from the horse and cart to the car, or the advent of international air travel, and its dramatic drop in price, 50% drop in the cost of air travel over the last 30 years. Or you could look at something like domestic automation, the washing machine. The first project I got involved in, or one of the first projects I got involved in when I became a futurist 6 years ago with LG, it was a very nice phone call to get. We've heard you're a futurist. Would you like to work with a global brand? Yes, I would. Thank you very much. And what they wanted to talk about was the future of domestic chores. And we started that by looking at the trend. We started that by looking at the past. And we went back 5 generations. We looked at how much time people in the UK spent on domestic chores 5 generations ago. And when I say people in the UK, let's be clear, it wasn't men spending 63 hours a week looking after the household. Arguably, it still isn't. But we did this study, we looked back 5 generations, 63 hours a week doing domestic chores, keeping the house running, to today, when people told us they do an average of 2 hours per week domestic chores. I was really sceptical about these numbers. When we did this survey, I'd just had my second child. I was doing 2 hours a day of washing, let alone 2 hours a week of housework. So I went to validate them. I looked around for other sources, people who'd done other studies. And they don't quite match up. The Office for National Statistics went back 4 generations, not 5. And they went from 44 hours a week to 18. I think they surveyed a lot more parents and a lot fewer students than perhaps we did. Nonetheless, the drop in hours that we have to spend keeping the house running is absolutely dramatic. It's a huge, sweeping change that I think we often underestimate the importance of. Because if you're spending 63 hours a week keeping the house running, there's no prospect of a career. There's no prospect of leisure time. There's no prospect of a leisure industry. And actually, I'm actually writing a book at the moment. I've been reading loads of extra papers around this. Academic papers that look at the role of domestic automation and the washing machine and the dishwasher in women's liberation, in changing the nature of the workforce, in creating the leisure industry. Massive changes that affected global cultures. Changes that affected us economically, changes that affected us socially, but changes that took a very long time. Adoption of these technologies started in the 1920s in the US, around the 1950s, much later in Europe. But it took 30 or 40 years for their impact to be truly felt. And the same is true of these other changes that historians point back to. The shift from horse and cart to car. We had cars, automobiles, something that looked like a car way back in the 1800s, but it took until the 1930s till we had anything that looked like a modern motor car, and we started to see volume sales of the Austin 7 or the Model A. These changes were dramatic. The advent of the motor car changed the way we live. We could live further from our families. We could shop further from our homes. We could work further from where we lived. We design our cities around these cars. They're massive changes, but they take a very long time to come about. And as a result, we can sort of see them coming. The difference now is, I think we see those changes, maybe not as dramatic, but over much shorter time periods. I think the way we have to think about change is not just whether it's fast or slow, but in 2 dimensions. How fast do those changes come? What is the frequency of those changes? And how big are they? Are they of great amplitude or little amplitude? And I think most of our businesses are set up to deal with low frequency, high amplitude changes. The big, sweeping, cross-cultural, global trends that we can sort of see coming. We'll still fail to recognise them sometimes. We'll still get wiped out by them sometimes. But at least we have processes in place to see them. Our planning is built around those sorts of timescales. What we're not set up for is these high frequency changes. Things that come in the next 2 to 5 years. Things that appear on the near horizon and may not affect us at this grand scale, but are enough to disrupt our business or our industry. I'll give you some examples. Starting with a slightly frivolous one. Back in about 2015, we started to see a particular type of video appearing on Instagram, particularly. And it showed some celebrity or other, Justin Bieber, Wiz Khalifa, other people whose music I studiously avoid, riding around green rooms or airports or stages on a hoverboard or balance board or swagway, whatever you want to call them. And these things looked cool. They made them look cool. Everyone started to want one. But there weren't many manufacturers of these things at this point. They were coming out of Shenzhen in China. There was 2 or 3 factories putting them out. Some smart thinking importers were bringing them in. And if you wanted to buy one, it would cost you about £1,500, $2,000 at this point. This is why it was celebrities riding them. They could either afford them or they were being sent them by influencer marketing agencies and paid to make videos. But very rapidly, people started to say, that's cool. And everyone picked up on this. First of all, the factories in China picked up on this. There's a slightly laissez-faire attitude to intellectual property, perhaps. And most of these things are based on entirely off-the-shelf parts. There was very little, arguably, intellectual property in them. So they started to duplicate them. They started to make them with slightly cheaper components, and the volumes started to come up. More importers caught on, recognized they could brand these things and bring them in and sell them much cheaper and still make a good profit. And by summer 2015, you could buy one of these on a market in the East End for 250 quid. And lots of people did. Did anyone buy one, by the way? Still using it?
Two, yeah. Not me. My son.
You say that.
I fell once and never got back on.
So they started to appear everywhere, and suddenly the newspapers and the magazines and the TV channels caught on. And they recognised this was a trend. And you can see the point at which they all caught on if you do a Google News search. And all of them were producing basically the same article. What is a hoverboard? Who's riding them? Reposting all of these videos that all of these celebrities have been putting out for the last few months. Very easy, cheap, quick clickbait. I did a whole raft of interviews around the same time explaining them. So this is September. 1 month later, the market for these things has crashed, collapsed. Just as the big retailers were catching on and thinking there's going to be some strange shaped stockings this year, we ought to be getting these things in. 2 things happened. First of all, the Department for Transport in the UK clarified where you are allowed to ride a hoverboard. And the answer is nowhere unless you are landed gentry. You can't ride them on the road, you can't ride them on the pavement, you can't even ride them in a park legally. My family found this out to our cost when my cousin was cautioned for riding one through the city centre of Lancaster. It's on YouTube, it's had a few 100,000 views because it's quite amusing. The second thing that happened was some exploded. And you don't have to be in marketing to know that that's not a good thing to happen to your product. There were some really serious incidents. Because rewind 6 months when those factories started to ramp up and the prices started to come down, they started to bring the price, the quality of some of the components down. And the 2 places you do not want to skimp on quality in your electronics is a battery management circuit and a lithium-ion battery. Some of the densest energy storage available outside of A, bombs, and B, petrol. Not a good idea. So we have this 6-month hype cycle. 6 months from nowhere to under the feet of Justin Bieber to on a market stall at a fraction of the price to absolutely nowhere. And when it hit nowhere, lots of people started to struggle. Those factories in Shenzhen that started to produce them at volume, they were quite often family businesses. Businesses who couldn't retool quick enough because of the speed at which the collapse came and went under. The importers with containers full of these things on a ship somewhere in the sea or in a warehouse in Portsmouth who couldn't shift them. The servicing companies, genuinely companies set up to service and repair and provide accessories for these things, went under. A 6-month hype cycle, incredibly contracted. And for me, this is indicative of the sort of change we're seeing now, this high frequency change. And we're seeing evidence of it in lots of other places as well. You think about the speed at which we adopt products. We've always adopted products and services. It's been condensing over the years. 80 years for the landline to hit 90% of US consumers. The numbers are roughly equivalent in the UK. 20 years for the mobile phone, 10 years for the smartphone, 5 years for Facebook, probably 6 months for whatever finally kills Facebook off. Something will. And these are the products and services that support so many companies. And maybe this rapid rate of adoption, this contracted hype cycle, is the reason we're seeing a much greater rate of disruption in the big companies. In companies like yours. This is a great piece of research out of the US looking at the Standard & Poor's 500, the 500 biggest companies on the US stock market. And it shows how long, over the course of history, companies could expect to spend in that position. If you were in the S&P 500 back in 1960, your lifespan in that list was typically 60 years. If you're there now, somewhere between 15 and 20. That is a very, very dramatic fall, a very, very dramatic increase in the turnover of these companies. It's high frequency change. I'm seeing lots of anecdotal evidence elsewhere as well. One of the really interesting pieces is in order sizes. I was chatting to a big distribution company that moves products around the world. And the scale and frequency of the orders they're dealing with has shifted dramatically over the last 10 years. Because 10 years ago, lots of their customers used to talk about things like just in time. But actually, they hadn't invested in the processes and the systems to really make it work. And warehouse space was relatively cheap in comparison to the complexity of fixing the systems. So they just do big orders to keep it safe and make sure they never run out of stuff. And now their clients are saying, we don't want to take that risk. We don't want that much of that stock just sitting there in case the wind changes. We'll actually make the investment now, not to improve cash flow or anything else, because we don't want to be saddled with products that we can't shift. They're asking for more and more deliveries, smaller and smaller, but ever higher frequency, to get over this high frequency of change. We're seeing it in employment contracts. What is the 0 hours contract about if it's not about flexibility and adaptability and an understanding that you need to respond to change more quickly? So if you're a curious person, and I am, you ask yourself, what's driven this? What's underpinning this shift from low frequency to high frequency change? My answer is that it's technology. And I mean technology in the broadest sense, not just transistors and bits and bytes and feeds and speeds. Technology in its broadest sense. Because technology's always done one thing for us. It's lowered friction. It's made our lives easier. Go back 350,000 years to the first tool-using proto-human. And forgive me, because I went to a comprehensive, we didn't study Latin. Australopithecus afariensis. I want to say that twice, I struggle with it so much. He picked up a rock and realized that using a tool, they could achieve their ends much more easily than just using their fists. Ever since then, human beings have used tools to make our lives easier, to reduce friction. In many ways, it's what defines us as a species. And this lowering of friction allows the increased rate of change, this high frequency change. We can experiment more quickly. We can build products more quickly. We can get to market more quickly. We can spread ideas more quickly. And so we do, challenged by competition. Technology is life's lubricant, and trust me, if you're searching for an image to illustrate that, turn on Google Safe Search first. Because if you search for lube on Google, that is not the first photo that comes up. Now, this lowering of friction doesn't just increase the rate of change. It doesn't just give us high-frequency change. It gives us a bunch of other effects as well. Because we can experiment more quickly and more cheaply, because we can produce more new products more easily, more people do. More products and services come to market. And in almost every market I look at, and I work across the absolute gamut, my favourite week when I went from talking about the future of super yachts to the future of supermarkets in 3 days. In every market I look at, we're seeing greater diversity of choice and competition. And it's perhaps best illustrated to what's happening to television. Because rewind 30-something years, when I got home from school, we had two choices. And forgive me, the Europeans and the Americans in the room, this may not resonate, but we had two choices, BBC and ITV. And I was thoroughly middle class, so BBC it was. And we watched Blue Peter and Grange Hill and Wacky Races. And then me, being a geek, went upstairs to watch Star Trek and The Next Generation on the tiny 14-inch portable, and somehow my younger sister got to keep the main TV to watch Neighbours. I still haven't worked out to this day how she won that battle. Compare that to the experience of my kids. My kids come home from school, pick up a remote that looks not dissimilar to this, and choose from 10,000 different programmes across the BBC and ITV and Channel 4 and Amazon and Netflix and YouTube. Actually, I don't let them watch YouTube yet. Too risky. And this has a really interesting effect, because when I went to school the next day, having watched telly the night before, we were all talking about the same characters, the same shows, the same cartoons. My 4-year-old, then 4-year-old, first day she went to nursery, first week she went to nursery, they got to dress up as their favourite characters. And the first hour that we were there was spent trying to work out how a princess with a sword integrates into a game with a dog with a jetpack. Because aside from the obligatory 2 Captain Americas and a Hulk, they'd all come as completely different people from different universes. My daughter was the princess with the sword. If it involves violence, magic, and long dresses, she's very happy. And we see this everywhere as you grow as well. You look at youth culture now. You talk to someone in their late teens and 20s, and actually I started this business, I employed a bunch of apprentices in part just to reconnect me with what it felt like to be young. You talk to them about this idea that growing up you had 2 social tribes, mods and rockers, in my day indie kids and ravers. You can guess which one I was. But we had 2 choices because it was geographically defined. My school, my area could only support so many social tribes. And so you picked one or the other, or you were neither, which was the worst of all worlds. You talk to someone in late teens, early 20s now, and this is anathema. They assemble their own identities from a huge range of online sources. I like this sport, and these books, and these videos, and these games, and this music, and this food. And they create their own unique identity from this huge range of social tribes, all of which they can be part of, because they're connected to it. Has its downsides. We've heard about the fracturing that fake news and news bubbles create. But nonetheless, it's an interesting phenomenon. It translates into business. I did a talk for the kitchen and bathroom industry at one point. A room like this, full of kitchen designers from all the big brands. It was about 3-4 years ago. And I found myself talking about Alibaba. And none of them had ever heard of Alibaba. Stopped the presentation. Opened up a web browser, Alibaba, kitchen units, 4,000 suppliers selling direct to the UK at half the price of everybody else in the room. Completely oblivious to this huge range of competition. You look at the grocery market. We're seeing some consolidation now. Why? Because new challenges have come in and disrupted the market. 2007, 2008, everyone was going for these giant out-of-town barns that sell everything. 2 years later, Aldi and Lidl have come into the market. Small format supermarkets are all the rage again. Everyone's shrinking their footprints, building smaller things to compete. You walk down my high street in Manchester, you will see an awful lot of diverse competition. The Polish grocer, the Romanian grocer, the Middle Eastern grocer, the Pakistani grocer. Huge, diverse competition. Random fact, actually, we spend £500 million a year on... No, it can't be £500 million. No, it is. It's £500 million a year on organic veg box delivery in the UK. £500 million a year. Maybe that was pre-recession. The other thing that this low friction has done is increased our expectations for performance and speed. There's a great story in the City of London that actually traders were saying the speed of light was not fast enough for them. They're building a new fibre optic pipeline that has an air gap in it so that the light can move fractionally faster from here to New York because the speed of light in a piece of glass was apparently not quick enough. When you're doing 100,000 trades a second per client and high-frequency trading, I guess that makes sense. But we all expect things faster now. Our expectations for how fast things should be delivered have gone up and up and up. And what's scary about this is that these expectations are portable. I do quite a lot of work with local authorities. When we started working with them on digital transformation, their expectations were that people would benchmark them against other bits of government or other local authorities, and they had to be as good as or better than them. No one cares that. Their benchmark was Amazon. Is the experience as good as Facebook? Is the experience as good as eBay? These expectations are hugely, hugely portable. And it puts an onus on us for how we take information in, how we process information, how we return decisions, how we communicate with customers. And this lowering of friction amplifies all of our capabilities. It amplifies our power. It allows every person in our organisation to do more with less. This has perhaps hit its greatest extreme in one company. Apple makes $1.3 million per employee per year. 1.3 million per employee per year. Visa, Google, Facebook all make upwards of $1 million per employee per year. In my last business, we thought we were doing really well if we were making 100,000. 1.3 million per employee per year. We're amplifying our cognitive capabilities. We're all hearing about artificial intelligence, machine learning. These things ultimately are going to displace jobs, potentially. The estimate's somewhere between 14% on the conservative side. 14% of jobs could be automated is the conservative estimate from the OECD. Up to 47%, one of the estimates that came out of Oxford University's Martin Management School. But also we're augmenting people, physically and cognitive people, allowing everybody to do more. You can now buy off the shelf an exoskeleton like Iron Man, to augment your strength for $14,000. Doesn't allow you to fly, or be a superhero, or shoot repulsors from your hands. But it will allow you to lift a bigger load, or hold a drill above your head for half a day. These things are being rapidly adopted in the construction sector. Every single person able to do more. And perhaps one of those dramatic changes, which is one of the most unseen, is that this low friction is changing the way we shape our organisations. About 15 years ago, Jeff Bezos sent a memo out to everybody in Amazon which said, and I'm paraphrasing, stop talking to each other. We don't want to be another Sears, for good reason it turns out. We don't want to be another Walmart. These giant monolithic organisations. These organisations have spent years optimising the way they work. But a lot of that's meant deeper and deeper integration. Often very human integration. And Bezos didn't want that. He said, take all the individual functions, take the functions of your business and wrap them in a layer. Wrap them in a layer of technology in this case, that publishes everything your function does, which tells us how to measure whether your function's working, and allow people, these functions, to interact with each other. Allow me to build your business up like a box of Lego bricks. Take each of your functions and build new businesses. One of those functions was part of IT. It was Amazon Web Services. Now the second biggest cloud computing company in the world. Only second because Microsoft overtook it earlier this year. That was possible because Amazon is broken down as a company into a box of Lego bricks with low friction wrappers around them that allow you to easily assemble new businesses out of those bricks, but also knock them down again if they don't work. And you remember Amazon Wine? Launched, tested, didn't work, shut down. And the only bit they had to shut down was that thin layer, that one Lego brick on the top, which took advantage of Amazon's payment engine, logistics engine, marketplace, hosting, all of which were common Lego bricks shared across the rest of the business. So what do we do about this? If you accept my argument that we've shifted from low frequency to high frequency change and that technology is what's driving this, how do you change the organisation to respond? And there's three things I teach companies and executives to do. The first one is about, and they're all based on characteristics of athletes, this idea of an athletic business. The first one is about athletes having heightened senses in two ways. Athletes are hyper-aware of their immediate environment, sharp-sighted, good ears, good that sort of peripheral sense of what's going on around them. But great athletes also have a very good strategic sense of what's going on. Always cautious about using football, and I mean soccer, analogies in this because you never know which team you're going to offend. Let's go for a safe one. The Andrea Pirlos of this world. The midfielders who can pick out that pass, who know when the winger is running without even looking. The runner, I was with Chris Akabusi the other day, for anyone who remembers him on record breakers or in the Olympics. The runners who can pick the time to make that sprint in the long distance run. Future-ready companies, athletic businesses, are extraordinarily close to their customers. They're very, very, very good at listening and actually hearing what customers and what the market says and responding quickly. They're also very good at taking decisions based on that information, which I'll give an example of in a second. But they're also really good at strategy. Most companies are very, very bad at planning across all timeframes. The 1 year time frame is pretty much always budget-driven and business as usual. I surveyed CFOs around the world with one of my clients recently, and 2/3 of CFOs admitted that their annual budget is based not on the strategy, but on last year's budget. Building a new budget fresh each year from the new strategy is too much work. They don't have the time to do it. It's hard enough getting it signed off as it is. So each budget is based on last year's budget. It does not reflect that year's strategy. We're bad at long-term planning. We often do what I call golf and post-its. And I facilitated a few of these days. The executive leadership team goes away to a hotel, sits in a room like this, has a facilitator, puts lots of post-it notes on the wall, does blue sky thinking about what they're going to do in 5, 10, 20 years' time. And the hotel just happens to be attached to a really nice golf course. Don't know why they chose it. And after that session in the hotel room, they all go and get spectacularly drunk. They play golf the next day. They go back to the office. And one poor person is tasked with writing up the notes and building a strategy. And it lasts about 3 days before it's abandoned. But the real big weakness is medium term. What's going to happen in the next 2 to 5 years? We're really poor at making proactive change unless there is an external emphasis, an external stimulus. A product's failed, the competitor's done something new. Proactively thinking about what we could do in the next 2 to 5 years is where I really focus on training people. I give them a new framework. I'm going to give you a lightweight version of it for how you think about what's coming in the next 2 to 5 years and plan proactively. The second thing future-ready companies are really good at doing is making decisions quickly. They either move information quickly through the organization. I think what you saw from Kollective earlier is really interesting on that, because that information has to move both ways. You have to get information to the decision makers fast, but you have to get changes in culture and policy and practice out to people quickly as well. Most companies are bad at this. One of my clients, we did a study, we worked out it took 12 weeks for information to get from a customer to a decision maker and back again. And that's not atypical. Got to move information quickly and you've got to move it cleanly. Again, it's why I like the idea of pushing video straight to the edge, because every person that information goes through on the way, it gets tainted and twisted. And in one direction, you get people basically covering their own arses. They don't want to move that information, the harsh reality of what the customer has said, back to the decision maker. They take the sting out of it as it goes. But also as the information comes back down, the instructions are lost, the values are lost, the importance is lost. Push it out directly and you don't get that. The absolute best thing you can do to accelerate decisions is push power to the edge of the organization. Don't centralize all of that decision making. Just like you're pushing all of this content to the edge, push power to the edge of the organization. My favorite case study of this comes from Lidl, the supermarket. Back in 2015, Lidl wasn't particularly known for carrying branded goods on its shelves. It was still the budget supermarket, the student supermarket. Unless, like me, you've got German family, in which case it's just the supermarket. And one of the first big branded lines that Lidl got in was One Direction Easter eggs. One Direction was still a big thing back in 2015. It was a big thing for Lidl. They were doing a lot of promotion around this. And then disaster struck. Trigger warning for any One Direction fans. Zayn left. Zayn leaves One Direction. The first thing Lidl knows about this comes into the social media manager. She dries her eyes and turns to the merchandising manager and says, "Get a cup of tea, bit of an issue. You know those Easter eggs? Zayn's left One Direction." The merchandising manager takes a deep breath and says, "Okay, well, 1/5 of the band's gone. We'll knock 1/5 of the price off." Social media manager goes, "Great, I can work with that. I'll get a tweet out." Tweet goes out, she gets the tone just right. It gets picked up by the One Direction fans who appreciate the tone, and it goes viral. And One Direction fans flood Lidl stores to pick up the last remaining Easter eggs with Zayn's face on. It was a big commercial success. Now, what's interesting about that decision is two things. First of all, it was taken entirely at the edge of the organisation by two junior members of staff. But second of all, that whole process, cup of tea and all, took 20 minutes. 20 minutes from the information coming in to the tweet going out. A massive commercial decision taken at incredible speed by two junior people. And I bumped into a board member of one of the other big supermarkets about a year ago. And I told her this story. And I said, could you do this now? Not 3 years ago, now. She said, not a chance. So a decision of that order of magnitude would have taken 3 days and multiple committees, and we would have missed the opportunity. But that's the benchmark now. Big commercial decisions taken at the edge by junior members of staff, but in a framework of responsibility and trust. They know what they can, they know what they can't do, but taken quickly. And the last thing you have to do is prepare the organisation for this new world. Because the biggest thing that high-frequency change means is that we have to train for 100 duck-sized horses, not one horse-sized duck. Most of our organisations are built for optimisation. We're trained in management school and business books for optimisation, to do what we do today but do it better tomorrow, to cost less with fewer people, to make more profit or for more people. But that only works if what you do today is going to be attractive tomorrow. And I think if you're going to build a business for sustainable success now, your focus should not be always on optimization. You can't be wasteful. But you have to be focused primarily on adaptation. How are we going to ensure that what we do tomorrow is what people are going to want? And that means changing the mindset. It means having processes in place for thinking about what's going to be tomorrow. And it means structuring the organisation so that you can change it radically, quickly, when the time comes. And very few organisations have engaged with that reality yet. But the really future-ready ones do. So, I've talked about a huge amount there in the last 45 minutes. I've seen a few nods, a few smiles, a few frowns. I've got time for a few questions before I sum up. Who has a question? I see catch boxes floating around, so you can even get a microphone. I might pick on someone if somebody doesn't jump in first. There we go.
What could Sears have done differently?
Could
What could Sears have done differently?
Sears?
Yeah.
It's a bit like the HMV story. So rewind a lot of years. I was working in marketing for Real Networks. And I ran the press conference where we launched legal music downloading. When Real Networks came together with the 5 major music labels and decided to finally, belatedly take on Napster. And even before that happened, if you were working in HMV, the big music retailer, it should have been clear the direction of travel. It should have been clear that you were extremely expensively shipping physical media to very expensively rented high street stores to a declining number of people who are going to want to buy that media. And they knew, they were told on at least 3 occasions what was going to happen. There's documented evidence of presentations to the board about what was going to happen. But the level of radical change to that business, a business that was still profitable at that point, that would have been required to retool it for the digital age, was just unpalatable. I don't think shareholders might have accepted it. They would have had no dividends for probably 5 years. The final business may well have been smaller than it was then. And it was very, very difficult to turn a tanker like that. And I think Sears in many ways is the same situation. The big challenge that department stores are facing now is trying to connect digital revenue with physical experience. So one of my clients is Salesforce. And with Salesforce's e-commerce platform, we did a huge piece of global research about millennials, was still a useful term then, and the high street. I mean, some millennials are now 40, you get this, like the oldest millennials are now pushing 40. But 5 years ago when we did this research, it was still a useful term. And we found that everybody, for different reasons, still likes the high street. They still want to visit shops and physically experience goods before they buy them. But as we all know, they then go on to buy them at the place they can get the best price, where they can get them delivered straight to their home. Sears, like all of the other shops of its ilk, should have been investing really, really early in how it could demonstrate to brands that we are the place that people can come and experience stuff, and you should pay us for that value, even if they ultimately buy it somewhere else. And no one's invested enough in solving that problem yet, and I'm not saying that people aren't trying to, they are. But if someone had invested much earlier on in solving that problem and connecting physical experience to digital revenue, even if that revenue is from a different business, I think the picture of high street retail and the struggles that particularly department stores in the US and the UK are facing today looks very, very different. That makes sense? Another question?
It's not part of what you've said today, but I did mention it because I've seen one of your podcasts on this graphene that's changing the way that we use graphite, silicone in everything from carbon fibre for cars and the shape of things and the chips that are going to be powering things. Can you just elaborate on what you see the future things that are happening along those lines?
So one of my roles is the resident futurist at the National Graphene Institute in Manchester. So you're familiar with graphene? This is it's a form of carbon that was discovered in Manchester about 10, 12 years ago. And it's a single layer, a layer of carbon atoms, a single atom thick. So it's a material, one of now about 1,100 they've discovered, where you can make a material that's a single atom thick. It's effectively two-dimensional. There is no third dimension, it is so thin. It is the strongest, lightest, most conductive material ever discovered. Think of that, strongest, lightest, and most conductive material ever discovered. And the possibilities for using it are absolutely transformative. Now, right now, we're really in the early stages of how we use it. We're mostly using it as powder and little platelets, but it's already going into things like bikes. So they built for high-performance athletes a bike that had graphene tires and a graphene frame. And what's different about it, it's not necessarily stronger or lighter, but it's stiffer. And when you're a really high-performance athlete, so much of your losses between the power of your legs and the wheels go in the frame and the tire flexing. If you take that flex out, they shaved seconds off the lap record for that athlete just by swapping him to a stiffer bike. Now you put that into a car and think about what that does. If you can shave seconds is a huge amount in high performance cycling. You put that into a car and think about what that does, the increase in stiffness, in safety, in performance, the reduction in weight. Ultimately, though, when we start to be able to produce this stuff in sheets, we're going to be able to make things that look like nothing ever has. So we all have an idea of what a chair looks like, right? If you make a chair out of metal, the legs are typically at least 1 inch across. We know the base has to be a sort of 1 inch piece of box section diameter. When you've got a material that is orders of magnitude stronger and lighter in steel, a chair no longer looks like we think a chair looks, because the legs can be so much thinner, the back can be so much thinner, the whole thing can be lighter. I often say that digital technology has changed the way the world works, but the coming range of 2D materials will change the way the world looks. If you're a science fiction geek like me, you're endlessly disappointed that the world still looks pretty much like it did 60 years ago. We are not living in Star Trek or the Jetsons. And that's because actually we've had relatively limited advances in material science. We can't make cars that look that different. But with these materials, we absolutely can. We can make things that look like they never have done before. And the applications are huge. As I say, the National Graphene Institute, everyone thinks it's just about this one carbon form, but they're researching 1,100 different materials now, which will change the way we will make microchips, change the way we make clothes, change the way we do medicine, change the way we make just about screens, just about everything. It is a staggering revolution to come, but we're still really, really in the early days of it. Well, so I'm going to do a quick time check. Look at that, 5 minutes to go. Perfect. So, to sum up, my argument is, and as I say, I am releasing a book next year, so you can read this in more depth, but we live in an age of high-frequency change. Not faster, not slower, but definitely different if we think of change in those two dimensions. Not just fast or slow, but frequency and amplitude. And we're all set up for these changes of great amplitude, but relatively low frequency. And we're now having to learn to deal with changes that are maybe smaller amplitude, but much less visible. They appear on the near horizon, and while they might not change countries or cultures, they can absolutely disrupt our businesses. And we've seen lots of brand names go by the wayside, disrupted by exactly that sort of change. And what do you do about it? First thing, improve your senses. If you do nothing else, look at how your company plans, how you plan. How do you plan in the short term? How do you plan in the medium term particularly? How do you plan, if at all, strategize for the long term? Accelerate the rate at which you make decisions, and the single best way to do that is to push things to the edges. Push power to the edges. Create a framework of responsibility around the junior people there. And accelerate the rate of communication out to that edge as well. Something you're already doing, clearly, as part of being here. But that communications channel is absolutely vital. And think about changing the shape of the organisation. If your organisation looks like a monolith, and a great test for this is if something has to happen, does somebody have to get up from their desk, go up 2 floors in the lift, go and knock on somebody else's door and ask for it to happen? Or is there a smooth information exchange between those different functions? If your organisation looks like a monolith, think about how fast you could change if that disruptive change did appear on the near horizon. So, I've done a little microsite for the people who are in this room. You can access this slide deck, and you can also access, as I promised, a really cut down version of the planning process I teach to clients. It's called 10 Questions to Help You Think About Tomorrow. It's got 5 questions about understanding the friction points in your organisation, where you might likely see disruptive change, and 5 questions about the big macro trends that are coming in and starting to change that. And you can also find me on LinkedIn and newsletter and podcast, etc. So yeah, that's me. Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.